June 6, 1944, 6:47 a.m., observation post Wolfsburg, 12 kilometers south of Sainte-Mère-Église. Hauptmann Klaus Richter pressed his Zeiss binoculars against his eyes, adjusting the focus as the dawn light revealed something impossible unfolding above the Norman countryside. Through the morning haze, aircraft formations stretched from horizon to horizon, their twin engines creating a mechanical thunder that seemed to shake the earth itself. In the bunker beside him, Oberst Friedrich von Stauenberg counted methodically, his staff training from the War College compelling him to document what military theory insisted could not exist. "Mein Gott," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the engine roar. "There must be thousands of them." What the Luftwaffe High Command in Berlin had calculated as logistically impossible was materializing above Normandy with mathematical precision. The American and British Air Forces, German intelligence had assured Wehrmacht commanders, could not possibly sustain the aircraft, fuel, and aircrew needed for an airborne operation of meaningful scale. Their transport capacity would collapse under its own weight. The assault would falter within hours due to supply limitations. Every assumption the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht had made about Allied air transport capabilities was about to be shattered by an armada of Douglas C-47s that represented the largest airborne operation in military history. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics that would determine the outcome of Operation Overlord were being written not in the trajectories of artillery shells or the thickness of armor plating, but in the production schedules of factories in Long Beach, Oklahoma City, and Santa Monica, where American workers were building transport aircraft at rates that defied German comprehension. The collapse of Wehrmacht confidence in German air superiority had begun 18 months earlier in the conference rooms of the Reich Air Ministry, where Luftwaffe planners had systematically underestimated American industrial capacity and strategic thinking. Their calculations were based on German limitations projected onto American capabilities, a fundamental error that would prove catastrophic when Douglas C-47s filled Norman skies in numbers that German theory insisted were impossible. May 15, 1943, Reich Air Ministry, Berlin. General Major Otto Hoffmann von Waldau, chief of the Luftwaffe operational staff, stood before a wall-mounted map of Europe, addressing senior officers about Allied invasion possibilities. The pointer in his hand traced potential landing sites along the French coast, while he outlined German defensive assumptions. "Gentlemen," von Waldau declared, his iron cross catching the light from overhead fixtures, "our intelligence indicates the Allies possess approximately 400 transport aircraft. Based on standard payload calculations, they could airlift perhaps one reinforced regiment in a single operation. This is tactically insignificant." The assembled officers nodded in agreement. Among them sat Major Hans von Luck, commanding the 21st Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion, recently transferred from North Africa after the collapse of the Afrika Korps. Von Luck had observed Allied air operations in Tunisia and Algeria, noting what appeared to be limited transport capabilities during the Operation Torch landings. Von Luck's observations from North Africa had been shaped by the limited scope of Allied airborne operations he had witnessed there. During the Tunisia campaign, American paratroop drops had involved company-sized forces scattered across wide areas, exactly the kind of limited penetration that German defensive doctrine was designed to counter. The jump at Aix-les-Bains in November 1942 had involved fewer than 600 American paratroopers, a force that German mobile reserves had contained and eliminated within 36 hours. What von Waldau and his staff did not know was that at that precise moment, American aircraft factories were producing C-47s at a rate of 348 aircraft per month. The Douglas Aircraft Company facility in Long Beach alone employed 44,000 workers, operating in 3 shifts around the clock, 7 days per week. Assembly lines that had been producing commercial airliners 18 months earlier had been transformed into military production centers where workers who had never seen a military aircraft were building the transport planes that would carry Allied paratroopers across the English Channel. The industrial transformation that enabled massive C-47 production represented a revolution in manufacturing that German observers consistently failed to understand. American factory design emphasized standardization, interchangeable parts, and assembly line efficiency, rather than the craftsmanship-based production methods that characterized German aircraft manufacturing. At the Douglas facility, workers installed identical engines manufactured by Pratt & Whitney using components produced by dozens of subcontractors across the United States. Each engine was built to specifications that ensured compatibility with any C-47 airframe, eliminating the custom fitting and individual adjustment that German aircraft required. The wing assemblies were produced on dedicated lines, where workers performed specialized tasks repeatedly, developing speed and precision that exceeded traditional craft methods. Wing panels rolled off production lines every 45 minutes, compared to German aircraft wing production that required days of skilled labor for hand fitting and adjustment. Fuselage construction followed similar principles of standardization and mass production. Aluminum sheets were cut by precision machinery, shaped by hydraulic presses, and welded by workers trained in specific techniques that could be mastered in weeks rather than the years required for traditional aircraft construction skills. The Douglas C-47, designated the Dakota by British forces, had become the workhorse of Allied transport aviation through a combination of American industrial engineering and strategic planning that German observers consistently misunderstood. Where German transport relied heavily on the lumbering Junkers Ju-52, a design that dated to 1930 and required extensive maintenance, the Americans had adapted a proven commercial airliner design for military purposes. The mathematical reality was devastating to German assumptions. By June 1944, Allied air forces possessed more than 2,000 C-47s in the European theatre alone, with additional hundreds arriving monthly. Each aircraft could carry 28 fully equipped paratroopers, or 6,000 pounds of supplies. The carrying capacity of the Allied transport fleet exceeded German calculations by more than 500%. The pilot training revolution that supported massive C-47 operations represented another area where German assumptions proved incorrect. American flight training had been industrialized using methods adapted from civilian aviation schools, enabling rapid pilot production without the extensive academic and military training that German pilots received. American transport pilots completed training programs lasting 16 weeks, compared to German transport pilots who required 40 weeks of training before operational assignment. The difference reflected fundamentally different approaches to military aviation, with American training emphasizing practical skills and standardized procedures, while German training emphasized theoretical knowledge and technical sophistication. The standardized cockpit layout of the C-47 meant that pilots trained on one aircraft could fly any other aircraft of the same type, without additional certification. German aircraft, with their individually crafted cockpit configurations and specialized instruments, required pilots to train specifically for each aircraft variant they would operate. Navigation training for C-47 pilots emphasized radio navigation and dead reckoning techniques that could be learned quickly and applied reliably under combat conditions. German pilots received more comprehensive navigation training that included celestial navigation and advanced theoretical knowledge, but this extensive training limited the number of pilots that could be produced annually. September 22, 1943, Luftwaffe Training School, Gatow. Oberst Wilhelm Schmalz, recently appointed to oversee paratroop training defenses, conducted a tactical exercise with newly promoted company commanders. The scenario involved defending against an Allied airborne assault somewhere along the Atlantic Wall. The enemy, Schmalz explained, using wooden blocks to represent aircraft on a sand table, will be limited by fuel capacity, aircraft availability, and pilot training. Intelligence suggests they cannot launch more than 200 transport aircraft simultaneously. Our defensive positions can absorb this level of assault. The young officers studied the tactical problem, calculating anti-aircraft gun positions and mobile reserve deployments. What they were planning to defend against was an airborne assault of perhaps 5,000 troops, a force that could be contained and destroyed by conventional defensive measures. Schmalz's defensive calculations were based on German experience with airborne operations, which had been limited to specialized missions involving elite forces with specific tactical objectives. The German airborne assault on Crete in 1941 had involved approximately 14,000 paratroopers, transported by 543 Ju-52 aircraft over multiple days, representing the largest airborne operation in German military experience. The Crete operation had demonstrated both the potential and limitations of airborne warfare as German planners understood it. Initial airborne assault had achieved tactical surprise and captured key objectives, but follow-up operations had been constrained by aircraft availability and pilot losses that limited sustained airlift capability. German defensive doctrine had been developed based on these operational experiences, assuming that Allied airborne operations would follow similar patterns of limited scale and duration. The mathematical assumptions underlying German defensive planning could not accommodate the industrial and logistical capabilities that American forces were preparing to demonstrate. Unknown to Schmalz and his students, American planners were already preparing for Operation Neptune, the airborne component of D-Day, which would involve over 800 C-47s plus hundreds of Horsa and Waco gliders. The 1st and 82nd Airborne Divisions were training for an operation that would place more than 13,000 paratroopers behind German defensive positions in a single night. The scale of Allied preparation defied every German assumption about logistical possibilities. At airfields across England, ground crews were stockpiling aviation fuel, ammunition, and supplies in quantities that German intelligence consistently underestimated. Allied planners had solved problems that German officers considered insoluble. The fuel logistics alone represented an achievement that German planners had calculated as impossible. Each C-47 consumed approximately 140 gallons of aviation fuel per mission, meaning that the D-Day airborne operation would require over 120,000 gallons of aviation fuel for the transport aircraft alone, not including fighter escorts and follow-up missions. German intelligence had calculated that Allied fuel supplies across the English Channel could not support sustained air operations of such intensity. Their estimates were based on German fuel shortages and logistical limitations projected onto Allied capabilities, failing to account for American refinery capacity and tanker shipping that had solved fuel supply problems on unprecedented scales. American petroleum production had increased dramatically during the war years, with refineries operating at maximum capacity to supply both domestic military needs and Allied forces worldwide. The Texas oil fields alone were producing more aviation fuel monthly than German planners believed could be transported across the Atlantic Ocean. The tanker fleet that delivered American petroleum products to British ports represented another area where German assumptions proved incorrect. American shipyards had solved tanker construction problems using mass production methods that enabled rapid replacement of shipping losses while expanding overall capacity. Where German planners focused on individual aircraft or ship capabilities, American planners had created integrated systems of production, transportation, and supply that achieved scales beyond German comprehension. The C-47 formations approaching Normandy represented just the visible component of industrial and logistical achievements that encompassed the entire American war economy. Where German airlift operations were limited by fuel shortages and aircraft maintenance requirements, American logistics provided reliable fuel supplies and maintenance capabilities that kept aircraft operational at rates approaching 90%. The C-47's radial engines, adapted from commercial aviation, could operate reliably for hundreds of hours between major overhauls, while German Ju-52 engines required intensive maintenance after every mission. The maintenance philosophy that supported Allied transport operations reflected industrial approaches that German aviation had not adopted. American aircraft were designed for maintenance by crews trained in standardized procedures, using tools and parts that were interchangeable across aircraft. German aircraft maintenance emphasized individual craftsmanship and specialized knowledge, requiring mechanics with extensive training and experience. While this approach produced thorough maintenance and potentially longer aircraft life, it limited the number of aircraft that could be maintained simultaneously and reduced overall operational availability. American maintenance crews could service multiple aircraft simultaneously using assembly line methods adapted for aircraft maintenance. Components were designed for rapid replacement rather than repair, enabling damaged aircraft to return to operational status quickly while maintaining consistent performance standards. The spare parts supply system that supported Allied air operations represented another achievement that exceeded German logistical capabilities. American factories produced spare parts in quantities that enabled complete aircraft reconstruction in forward maintenance areas, while German spare parts production struggled to meet basic replacement needs. December 8, 1943, Army Group B Headquarters, La Roche-Guyon. Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, recently appointed to inspect Atlantic Wall defenses, reviewed intelligence estimates about Allied invasion capabilities with his staff. The discussion focused on potential airborne threats to German coastal positions. The British demonstrated limited airlift capacity during their failed Arnhem operation, Rommel observed, referring to preliminary intelligence about Allied planning. We must prepare for scattered drops of battalion-sized forces, not massed assault. Rommel's assessment reflected German understanding of airborne operations based on their own limitations. The Luftwaffe's transport capacity had been devastated by losses on the Eastern Front and fuel shortages. German paratrooper operations, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, had been reduced to company-sized missions due to aircraft and pilot shortages. The comparison to Arnhem revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that characterized German intelligence about Allied capabilities. Operation Market Garden in September 1944 would indeed demonstrate limitations in Allied airborne planning and execution, but those limitations were tactical and operational rather than industrial or logistical. The aircraft and pilot resources that Allied forces committed to Arnhem exceeded total German transport aviation capabilities by substantial margins, yet German observers interpreted the operation's tactical failure as evidence of fundamental Allied limitations, rather than recognizing the massive scale of resources that had been committed to the operation. What Rommel could not anticipate was the massive infrastructure development occurring across England as Allied forces prepared for D-Day. American engineers had constructed or expanded dozens of airfields specifically to support the invasion. Ground crews were training for simultaneous operations involving hundreds of aircraft, while pilots flew practice missions that coordinated transport formations larger than anything Germany had ever attempted. The airfield construction program that supported Allied invasion preparations represented an engineering achievement that German observers had not anticipated. American engineering battalions had transformed agricultural areas into operational airfields, using construction methods and equipment that enabled rapid completion of projects that German engineers would have required months to accomplish. Each airfield required not just runways and taxiways, but fuel storage facilities, ammunition bunkers, maintenance, hangars, and accommodation for thousands of personnel. The scale of construction indicated Allied commitment to invasion preparations that exceeded German intelligence estimates of Allied intentions and capabilities. American construction equipment, including bulldozers, graders, and concrete mixers, enabled rapid airfield construction using standardized designs that could be implemented by crews with minimal specialized training. German construction methods, while thorough and permanent, required skilled workers and extensive time that Allied invasion schedules could not accommodate. The organizational achievement represented by Allied airborne planning extended beyond aircraft production into pilot training, ground crew preparation, and logistical coordination. American flight schools were producing transport pilots at rates that exceeded total German pilot production for all aircraft types. The training command had established procedures for mass formation flying that allowed hundreds of aircraft to operate in coordinated waves without collision or confusion. Formation flying training for transport pilots emphasized standardized procedures and radio communication protocols that enabled large formations to operate safely under combat conditions. German transport pilots, while individually more skilled, had not trained for the massive formation operations that Allied planners were preparing. The radio communication systems that coordinated Allied transport formations represented another technological advantage that German forces had not anticipated. American radios were standardized, reliable, and produced in quantities that enabled every aircraft to maintain constant communication with formation leaders and ground controllers. German radio equipment, while technically sophisticated, was produced in limited quantities and required specialized maintenance that reduced operational reliability. The result was that German transport operations relied heavily on visual, signals and predetermined procedures that could not accommodate the complex coordination required for massive formation operations. March 14, 1944, Headquarters 84th Corps, Cherbourg. General der Artillerie Erich Marx conducted a war game with divisional commanders defending the Cotentin Peninsula. The exercise assumed an Allied airborne assault supporting a seaborne invasion, with German forces required to respond to multiple simultaneous threats. Intelligence suggests, Marx explained to his assembled commanders, that enemy airborne forces cannot exceed regimental strength due to transport limitations. Our mobile reserves can contain and eliminate any airborne penetration within 24 hours. The wargame proceeded based on German assumptions about Allied capabilities. Defending forces practiced responding to an airborne assault, involving perhaps 2,000 paratroopers scattered across multiple drop zones. German mobile reserves, including elements of the 21st Panzer Division, demonstrated their ability to counterattack and eliminate isolated airborne units before they could consolidate their positions. Marx had extensive experience with defensive operations, having commanded corps-level forces on the Eastern Front, where German forces had successfully contained Soviet airborne operations through rapid counterattack by mobile reserves. Soviet airborne assaults had typically involved limited forces with specific tactical objectives, exactly the kind of operations that German defensive doctrine was designed to counter. The mathematical calculations that supported German defensive confidence were based on established ratios between attacking and defending forces under conventional circumstances. German planners assumed that airborne forces, lacking heavy equipment and artillery support, would be particularly vulnerable to counterattack by armored formations. What the German commanders practicing these defensive scenarios could not imagine was an airborne assault involving over 20,000 Allied paratroopers and glider-borne infantry, supported by hundreds of fighter aircraft and coordinated with massive naval bombardment. The scale of Operation Neptune exceeded German planning assumptions by such vast margins that existing defensive doctrine became irrelevant. The night of June 5 to 6, 1944, would demonstrate the catastrophic gap between German assumptions and Allied capabilities. As Hauptmann Richter and Oberst von Stauenberg watched from their observation post, wave after wave of C-47s approached the Norman coast carrying the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, plus British airborne forces. The mathematical reality was overwhelming. 850 C-47s plus hundreds of gliders were delivering the largest airborne assault in military history. German anti-aircraft batteries, positioned to defend against limited airborne penetration, found themselves facing aircraft formations that stretched beyond their defensive sectors. The Luftwaffe, which German commanders had expected to intercept and destroy transport aircraft, was virtually absent from Norman skies. The absence of effective Luftwaffe response to the massive Allied airborne assault revealed another area where German assumptions had proven incorrect. Luftwaffe planners had assured ground commanders that fighter aircraft would intercept and destroy Allied transport formations, making large-scale airborne operations impossible. The reality was that the Luftwaffe had been reduced to fewer than 300 operational fighter aircraft in the entire Western European theatre, compared to more than 3,000 Allied fighter aircraft supporting the invasion. German pilots, while individually skilled, were overwhelmed by numerical disadvantages that made effective interception impossible. Fuel shortages that limited German fighter operations to brief defensive missions meant that Luftwaffe aircraft could not sustain the extended combat necessary to disrupt massive Allied transport formations. Allied fighter escorts, with superior fuel capacity and numerical advantage, could maintain air superiority over the invasion area for hours at a time. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Von Stauenberg later wrote in his memoir about the psychological impact of witnessing this massive airborne armada. "We had calculated based on our own limitations," he reflected. The Americans were operating according to entirely different mathematical principles. They had aircraft in quantities we considered impossible, pilots we thought they could not train, and fuel we believed they could not supply. The C-47 formations approaching Normandy represented more than tactical surprise. They demonstrated a fundamental revolution in military affairs that German planning had failed to comprehend. Industrial warfare required not just better weapons or superior tactics, but vastly superior productive capacity and logistical capability. The aircraft filling Norman skies had been produced by American factories that operated around the clock, staffed by workers who had been trained in months rather than years. The fuel powering these aircraft came from refineries that German planners had assumed could not supply such massive operations across ocean distances. The pilots flying these missions had been trained by flight schools that produced more aviators monthly than German schools graduated annually. The training revolution that enabled massive Allied pilot production represented a fundamental shift in military education that German institutions had not anticipated. American flight training emphasized practical skills and standardized procedures that could be learned quickly, while German pilot training focused on theoretical knowledge and technical sophistication that required extensive time. American training methods had been adapted from civilian aviation schools that had developed efficient instruction techniques for commercial pilots. These methods emphasized simulator training, standardized procedures, and rapid skill development rather than comprehensive academic education. The result was that American training programs could produce competent pilots in months, while maintaining safety standards that compared favorably with more extensive German training programs. The mathematical advantage was decisive. American flight schools graduated more pilots monthly than German schools produced annually across all aviation specialties. As the massive formations passed overhead, German observers began to understand that they were witnessing not just an airborne assault, but a demonstration of American industrial and organizational capacity that rendered German defensive calculations obsolete. The mathematical assumptions underlying Wehrmacht planning had been based on German limitations projected onto American capabilities, a fatal analytical error that was becoming apparent as thousands of Allied paratroopers descended into Normandy under cover of an air armada that German theory insisted could not exist. The implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. If the Americans could mount airborne operations of this scale, what did that suggest about their overall military-industrial capacity? If they possessed transport aircraft in these quantities, what did that indicate about their bomber production, fighter aircraft numbers, or naval construction capabilities? The interconnected nature of American military production meant that transport aircraft capability reflected broader industrial achievements that encompassed all aspects of military equipment. The factories producing C-47s were part of an integrated industrial system that also produced bombers, fighters, and naval vessels using similar methods of mass production and standardization. German intelligence had consistently underestimated this industrial integration, treating each type of military equipment as a separate production challenge rather than recognizing the systematic approach that American industry had developed for military production across all categories. The organizational methods that enabled massive C-47 production were being applied simultaneously to bomber production, fighter aircraft manufacturing, and naval construction, creating industrial capabilities that exceeded German comprehension when considered as integrated systems rather than individual achievements. June 6, 1944, 7:30 a.m., German 7th Army Headquarters, Le Mans. General der Artillerie Friedrich Dollmann received the first reports from forward observers about the scale of Allied airborne operations. The initial estimates seemed impossible, but reports from multiple observation posts confirmed massive aircraft formations approaching the invasion beaches. "Sir," his operations officer reported, voice strained with disbelief, Preliminary counts suggest over 1,000 transport aircraft in the first wave alone. Ground observers report continuous formations for over 2 hours. Dolman studied the tactical map, trying to comprehend the implications. His defensive planning had assumed limited airborne penetration that could be contained by mobile reserves. The scale being reported suggested airborne forces approaching divisional strength, far beyond German defensive calculations. The radio communications from forward units painted an increasingly desperate picture. German strongpoints were reporting airborne landings throughout their sectors, far exceeding the scattered drops that defensive doctrine was designed to counter. The Wehrmacht had prepared to fight a limited airborne assault. Instead, they were facing a coordinated airborne army, supported by air superiority that eliminated German ability to respond effectively. The systematic nature of Allied airborne operations revealed planning sophistication that German officers had not attributed to American military leadership. Rather than scattered drops designed to achieve specific tactical objectives, the airborne assault was coordinated to paralyze German defensive responses across entire sectors. Drop zones had been selected to isolate German strongpoints, prevent communication between defensive positions, and block the movement of mobile reserves. The result was that German defensive forces found themselves unable to coordinate effective responses or concentrate sufficient force to eliminate airborne penetrations. What Dolman and his staff were discovering was that American planners had solved fundamental problems in airborne warfare that German officers considered insoluble. The logistics of fuel supply, aircraft maintenance, pilot training, and operational coordination had been addressed through industrial and organizational methods that exceeded German comprehension. The C-47 itself represented this American approach to military problems. Where German planners focused on technical perfection and tactical sophistication, American designers had created aircraft that could be mass-produced, easily maintained, and operated by rapidly trained pilots. The result was not necessarily superior individual aircraft, but vastly superior operational capability through quantity and reliability. German transport aircraft design philosophy emphasized specialized performance and technical advancement, resulting in aircraft that required extensive maintenance and skilled crews. The Ju-52, while reliable in German hands, demanded maintenance capabilities and operational procedures that limited mission frequency and aircraft availability. The C-47, adapted from the commercial DC-3 airliner, had been designed for continuous operation with minimal maintenance requirements. American airline experience had taught designers that aircraft needed to operate reliably day after day with basic maintenance, lessons that translated directly to military requirements. The maintenance revolution that enabled massive Allied airborne operations represented another area where German assumptions proved incorrect. Allied ground crews had been trained for rapid aircraft turnaround, enabling multiple missions per day when necessary. German maintenance procedures, while thorough, required time and resources that limited operational tempo. Aircraft availability rates demonstrated this fundamental difference in approach. Allied transport aircraft maintained operational readiness rates exceeding 85%, while German transport aviation struggled to achieve 60% availability due to maintenance requirements and spare parts shortages. The pilot training disparity was equally significant. American flight schools had adapted commercial aviation training methods for military purposes, enabling rapid pilot production without sacrificing safety or competence. German pilot training, while more comprehensive individually, could not produce pilots quickly enough to match Allied requirements. By June 1944, Allied air forces possessed not just more aircraft, but more trained pilots than German forces could field across all aviation branches. American training commands were graduating more transport pilots monthly than Germany trained for all aviation specialties combined. The fuel mathematics were perhaps most devastating to German defensive assumptions. Allied operations over Normandy consumed aviation fuel at rates that German planners had calculated as unsustainable across ocean supply lines. The reality was that American refinery capacity and tanker shipping had solved fuel supply problems that German logisticians considered insoluble. Each C-47 consumed approximately 1 140 gallons of aviation fuel per hour of flight time. The airborne armada over Normandy was burning fuel at rates approaching 15,000 gallons per hour during the assault phase. German calculations had suggested that such fuel consumption could not be sustained, yet Allied operations continued for weeks without apparent fuel limitations. The broader implications of this massive airborne demonstration began to penetrate German strategic thinking as the battle for Normandy developed. If American industrial capacity could support airborne operations of this scale, while simultaneously conducting massive naval operations and strategic bombing campaigns, what did that suggest about overall Allied military potential? German intelligence had consistently underestimated American productive capacity across all military categories. The aircraft formations over Normandy suggested that previous estimates of American bomber strength, fighter production, and naval construction were equally flawed. If transport aircraft existed in these quantities, Allied military production must exceed German calculations by enormous margins. The psychological impact on German officers observing the massive airborne assault extended beyond immediate tactical concerns. Many Wehrmacht professionals had based their confidence in ultimate German victory on assumptions about relative industrial capacity and military potential. The D-Day airborne armada shattered these assumptions in the most visible and undeniable manner possible. For field commanders like Oberst von Stauenberg, watching thousands of Allied aircraft approach Norman beaches demonstrated that Germany was fighting an enemy whose capabilities had been fundamentally misunderstood. The mathematical foundations of German strategic planning had been based on incorrect assumptions about Allied limitations. The organizational achievement represented by Operation Neptune's airborne component revealed American military planning and execution capabilities that German officers had not anticipated. Coordinating hundreds of aircraft in night formation flying while delivering thousands of paratroopers to specific drop zones required planning, sophistication, and execution precision that exceeded German expectations of American military competence. German military doctrine emphasized technical superiority and tactical excellence, assuming that these advantages would compensate for potential numerical disadvantages. The massive Allied airborne assault demonstrated that American forces possessed not just numerical superiority, but organizational and logistical capabilities that neutralized German tactical advantages. The airborne armada over Normandy represented a revolution in military affairs that German strategic thinking had failed to anticipate. Industrial warfare required not just better weapons or superior tactics, but fundamentally different approaches to production, training, and logistics that privileged quantity, reliability, and sustainability over individual technical excellence. As the C-47 formations continued their approach to the Norman coast, German observers began to understand that they were witnessing the military manifestation of American industrial society. The aircraft filling the skies had been produced by factories that operated according to principles of mass production and standardization that German industry had not fully embraced. The deeper lesson becoming apparent to Wehrmacht officers was that modern warfare had evolved beyond the scope of traditional military factors. Victory would be determined not by tactical skill or technical superiority, but by productive capacity, logistical efficiency, and organizational capability applied on scales that German planning had not contemplated. The American approach to airborne warfare, demonstrated so dramatically over Normandy, revealed a military philosophy based on overwhelming material superiority rather than tactical elegance. Where German planners sought perfect solutions executed by elite forces, American planners sought adequate solutions executed by massive forces with reliable equipment and comprehensive support. The C-47 formations approaching the invasion beaches carried more than Allied paratroopers. They carried proof that American industrial and organizational capacity had achieved scales that rendered traditional German military calculations obsolete. The mathematics of modern warfare had changed, and Germany had failed to adjust their strategic thinking accordingly. 9:15 a.m., June 6, 1944, Observation Post Wolfsburg. As the last formations of Allied transport aircraft disappeared beyond the invasion beaches, Hauptmann Richter lowered his binoculars and turned to Oberst von Stauenberg. The silence between them carried the weight of recognition that everything they had believed about German military superiority had been shattered by what they had witnessed. "How many do you estimate?" von Stauenberg asked quietly, his voice reflecting the systematic mind of a general staff officer trying to process information that contradicted every assumption underlying German defensive planning. "Conservative estimate," Richter replied, consulting his notes. 800 transport aircraft minimum, probably over 1,000 including gliders. That suggests airborne forces approaching 20,000 men, sir. Von Stauenberg nodded grimly. German defensive doctrine had prepared for airborne penetration involving perhaps 5,000 troops scattered across multiple drop zones. The scale they had witnessed exceeded defensive calculations by factors that made existing contingency plans irrelevant. The radio crackled with reports from observation posts along the Norman coast. Each report confirmed the massive scale of Allied airborne operations while revealing the systematic breakdown of German defensive responses. Anti-aircraft. Batteries reported being overwhelmed by aircraft numbers that exceeded their engagement capacity. Mobile reserves found themselves responding to airborne landings across sectors too wide for effective concentration. "They're not fighting the way we expected," von Stauenberg observed, studying the tactical map where red markers indicated reported airborne landings. "This isn't tactical infiltration. This is strategic penetration designed to paralyze our entire defensive system." What the German commanders were recognizing was that American military planners had approached airborne warfare from fundamentally different conceptual premises. Where German doctrine emphasized precision drops of small elite forces to achieve specific tactical objectives, Allied planners had designed airborne operations to overwhelm defensive systems through scale and coordination. The mathematical reality was that German anti-aircraft defenses had been positioned to engage limited aircraft formations, not continuous streams of hundreds of transport planes. German mobile reserves had been organized to respond to isolated airborne penetrations, not coordinated airborne assaults across entire army sectors. The failure was not tactical but conceptual. German planning had been based on German limitations extrapolated to American capabilities, fundamentally misunderstanding the industrial and organizational revolution that American military forces represented. In their final reports about the Allied airborne assault, von Stauenberg and other Wehrmacht officers acknowledged that what they had witnessed represented a revolution in military affairs that German strategic thinking had failed to anticipate. The war would be decided not by tactical excellence or technical superiority, but by productive capacity and organizational capability applied on scales that traditional military doctrine had not contemplated. The C-47 formations that had approached Normandy carried more than Allied paratroopers. They carried the mathematical proof that American industrial democracy, when mobilized for war, could achieve scales of military production and organization that rendered traditional European military calculations obsolete. The Wehrmacht had prepared to fight World War I with better equipment. The Americans had invented World War II with industrial methods that German strategic thinking had not comprehended until it was demonstrated over Norman skies in formations too large to count and too powerful to stop. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.